I'm John Henry Westen. Thank you for joining me on Truth and Lies, the show where we work together to shed light on common misconceptions and come to a fuller understanding of the truth. In my work in media, I have found that it is essential to speak the truth with love. Love for all people, because we are all children of God. And with that in mind, let's have a look at this week's topic. Prostitution a career choice? Is prostitution a valid career choice? Well, let's take a minute to think about that. Do you agree? Do you disagree? And why? Is that your opinion? Perhaps the opinion of someone you know? Maybe you've not had a chance to think about this issue before. Well, now is our chance to think about it, to learn about it, and to talk about it. Within this topic area, there are many lies that creep into society. I'm going to show you some of those that we are going to address on this program.
Do you think prostitution is a career?
I think people have the right to choose sex work as a career if they want.
Do you think prostitution is harmful?
Hey, sex and prostitution is consensual, so who gets hurt?
Don't you think prostitution should be stopped?
Prostitution has been going on forever. It's impossible to stop it. We need to be working towards making it safe instead.
Why do you think prostitution is needed?
I heard that having prostitution as an option helps men from resorting to sexual abuse to fulfill their sexual needs.
The prostitution industry makes $186 billion worldwide. The United States alone controls $14.6 billion in the industry. Prostitution has a direct link to rape. When women are prostituted and turned into objects for men's sexual use, they can be either bought or stolen. A culture in which women can be bought for use is one in which rape flourishes. Prostitution, even if legalized as a career or business, can never truly be legitimate, because it will always be associated with crime, corruption, class, mass sexual exploitation, and human trafficking. Many women have themselves described prostitution as paid rape and voluntary slavery. Prostitution involves sexual harassment, sexual exploitation, or oftentimes something much worse. Women in prostitution have the highest rate of rape and homicide of any group of women ever studied. They are regularly physically assaulted and verbally abused, whether they prostitute on the street or in massage parlors, brothels, or hotels. Sexual violence and physical assault are the norm for women in legal prostitution. In one Dutch study, 60% of women in legal prostitution were physically assaulted. 70% were threatened with physical assault. 40% experienced sexual violence, and 40% had been coerced into legal prostitution. The life of the average prostitute can be summed up in two words: alienation and exploitation. Many prostitutes have felt disempowered and alienated from society, their parents, their families, all their lives. Many prostitutes are the product of abusive homes, running away at a young age where they are unqualified to work in a legitimate industry. They ultimately resort to prostitution as a means of getting by. To speak more about prostitution and its effects, we have in the studio Joseph Sciambra. Formerly involved in the gay porn industry, Chambre is now an author and activist educating others about the real-life issues involved in pornography and homosexuality.
Joseph, maybe you can begin by telling us about your background with prostitution and then how you came to sex work yourself.
Okay. Well, it all begins when I was about 8 years old and I was exposed to pornography. And it was Playboy and the Penthouse variety because, of course, this is before the internet and it's even before home video systems. So there were no cassettes or anything like that that you could watch at home. So by the time I was a teenager, I was pretty much thoroughly confused about what sex was. Mm-hmm. Was it love? What was it all about? I didn't understand women. I didn't have good relationships with girls at that time, I think, because of pornography. and I had sexualized women for the most part. So when I became of age, when I was 18, one of the first things I did was I sought out prostitutes. Those were my first sexual experiences with women, was with a prostitute. It was a pretty earth-shattering experience, because our vision a lot of times of prostitutes is a lot of times glamorized. If you look at most of the women that have won the Oscar for acting, the majority have won it for being a prostitute. Shirley Jones, Jane Fonda, Liza Minnelli, but they certainly didn't look like that, the women that I met. It was a sad life. They were normally drug addicted, a lot of times mentally ill, not that attractive because of those things, having bad teeth, but they were willing to have sex for money, and for the most part, they were willing to do just about anything that I wanted. And because I had been raised on pornography, my tastes by the time I was a teenager were pretty kinky.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Now, you mentioned movies that, actresses that received awards for being prostitutes. You mean prostitutes in the film?
Right.
Okay, so like Pretty Woman or something like that.
Correct. That film is very dangerous, I think, because it made Julia Roberts a star, and she's a very beautiful woman. And in the film, she was portrayed as very beautiful.
Right.
And of course, she meets her Prince Charming and sweeps her off her feet. And you don't see any of the dark side of prostitution in that film. You know, people getting beat up. You don't see pimps. You don't see drugs. You don't see AIDS.
All of which you're saying are very common in prostitution.
Very, very much. Actually, visiting street prostitutes it just became so dangerous and so dark. I ended up driving, usually with a bunch of friends of mine, up to Nevada, to Reno, to go to the legal brothels, hoping that, that would be a different experience. And, it really wasn't.
Wow.
Yeah.
What are some of the things that you saw that were so disturbing to you?
Well, even in Nevada, where it's regulated and it's legal, the women, of course, were prettier. Of course, it's more expensive, but it was just a very sad experience, because the women inevitably would complain to you about either their husbands or boyfriends have forced them into this prostitution. Yes, and they just tended to talk to you, because you were a human being and you were there, and it was a downer when you didn't really want to care for them.
Yeah.
You just wanted to go there, use them as a sex object, and leave. Wow. But inevitably, these women would always end up talking about their very sad lives.
You mentioned a lot of them were into drugs and alcohol and things like that.
Yes.
How common is that? Is that, you saw one or lots? Or?
I would say that the women that are on the streets are there because they have a drug addiction. And it's the only way they can supply it. Usually their pimp is the one that is supplying them their drugs. So they're working for their pimp, giving him all of the money, and then he is supplying them with drugs.
Wow.
Yeah.
So I guess that makes almost a joke of the idea that this is a career choice, that should be some valid...
It's an act of desperation for these people. Yeah. I never met a female prostitute that enjoyed what she was doing.
Wow. Now, you say in the place where it was legal and regulated, and it wasn't all fine there either.
No, I mean, it was the outward covering was prettier. I mean, the place was clean. You weren't picking up women off the street. You didn't have to worry about a cop. But even in San Francisco, in the Bay Area, they really don't enforce prostitution laws. But again, the women were just sad. They were depressed. They certainly weren't into what they were doing. And I quit. And I ended up going back to street prostitutes for a while.
Now, you also experienced this life sort of on the other side.
I did.
Selling yourself for sex.
I did, yeah.
What happened there?
Yeah, it was later. It's when I entered because, you know, I was gay at one time. And when I went into the gay lifestyle, I would see, you know, male hustlers, male prostitutes in the Castro and in San Francisco. And I really thought that they were pretty much the lowest of the low, picking up guys. Usually the clientele in the gay world are older men that pick up young boys, younger men. And I looked at these guys and I really judged them. And I thought, you know, I would never do that. Well, as the years went by, towards the end of my time in that life, I ended up being one of those people. I ended up a hustler. And I ended up being picked up in parks, public lavatories.
What does a hustler mean? What's a hustler?
A hustler is a gay prostitute.
Okay.
Yeah. You know, we're not called hookers or call girls or, you know, some people could say, well, we're an escort. But if you're, you know, being picked up by men in a car, you're a hustler.
Okay.
And that's what I ended up doing.
Did it feel empowering? Did it feel like it was a good job opportunity or something that what?
No. You know what does end up happening is that by the time you've made that choice, you're pretty filled with a lot of hate. It was a good way to get aggression out because, you know, it was sort of, you did sort of have a power trip a bit over people because you were manipulating them and there was just a lot of hate involved.
Wow.
And that's for anybody involved in prostitution. You end up hating the other person very, very much, the person that's picking you up.
Yeah.
And women eventually, a lot of them become lesbians because they end up hating men so much. They don't want to be with a man, of course, because men are evil in their eye.
All they see is the sort of abuse of
and they're abused very, very severely.
This whole concept of sexuality is so warped. I remember when I actually entered into the pro-life movement, I heard something very strange from a Catholic philosopher by the name of Peter Kreeft. And he said, do you ever notice how the whole of the culture war is about one thing? It's like, what's he talking about? Because, you know, the culture war is like, you know, abortion and homosexuality. And, well, he said that. He mentioned all these things. He mentioned this laundry list of, I don't know how many things, a dozen or more things. He said, abortion, contraception, prostitution, pedophilia, sex before marriage, sex outside of marriage, masturbation, even embryonic stem cell research and in vitro fertilization, sex education, and so on. And he went on with this huge list. And then he said, you ever notice they're all about one thing? All about sex. Okay, I can see that, but that's really weird. But it related to something else that I had read during my conversion process, and it was about Our Lady of Fatima. One of the messages that Our Lady gave to the children really struck me, and that was that Our Lady said, more people go to hell because of sins of the flesh than for any other reason.
Yes.
That's 1917. That's not only pre-internet. It's like pre-television and magazines. And so, you know, obviously one of the questions is, where the heck have we come since then, now that we're completely pornified? But beyond that, that made for me this unbelievable connection. Peter Kreeft says the whole culture war seems to revolve around this thing. And Our Lady of Fatima tells the children, more people go to hell because of this than for any other reason. Do you have any thoughts on that?
It's extremely seductive. Prostitution, pornography, all of these deviances can be very beautiful on the outside. And it's a lot of temptation there, especially when you're young and you see that and you become immune to it. So when you become older, of course, you're drawn to that. because it doesn't seem to be abnormal at all. Strange sexual practices, prostitution, pornography, homosexuality, whatever. And it can be very beautiful, like I said, but that's very much on the surface. When you get into the life and you see it, then it's a very different story. And that's the trick of the devil. I mean, he's deceiving us, getting us to buy into something that is evil.
It's very interesting you say that, a trick of the devil, because that, I think, was when I came to an understanding, a sort of a light went on. It was with regard to exactly that, the devil, and John Paul II's theology of the body. In Theology of the Body, the Holy Father described from the ancient church fathers how they described the Trinity as that relationship between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, where the Father gives himself completely over to the Son in full love and full giving of himself, the Son returning that same love to the Father, and that mutual self-giving of love was described by the early fathers of the church as the person of the Holy Spirit. So there was sort of the image of the family, if you will, husband giving himself fully to the wife, wife fully to the husband, and their mutual self-giving, the person of the child. Right. Sort of a reflection of Trinitarian love that's stamped right in creation and put throughout all time and all generations in all places.
Correct.
In Corinthians, Paul talks about what everybody who's 14 years of age and over says, oh, I know what he's talking about, where he says, and for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. And everybody goes, I know what he's talking about. I totally get that. And in the next line, he says something completely mind-warping. He says, and what I'm talking about is the relationship of Christ to his church. And you're mind-blown. You go, what?
Yes.
But it's true. That relationship of husband and wife, that coming together as one flesh, is compared directly to Christ's relationship with his church when he joins us in Holy Communion, becoming one flesh with us as well. Yet, here is the image God has stamped throughout mankind right from creation of the Trinitarian relationship, of the relationship of Christ to his church. And if you're the devil, and it's your job to keep people out of that relationship, out of heaven, to join you in hell, if that's God's primary example, that's going to be your primary attack. The understanding of sexuality as a gift, as a reflection of the Trinity. How have you seen that in your life since your conversion?
In my life? Because growing up, looking at pornography and then getting involved in prostitution and being with prostitutes, I really didn't understand anything about the soul, the body, God, how all these things work together. I just, when you get into that life, you just sort of see yourself alone. At that time, I didn't have any really belief in God. I got into the occult. And because you really can't see yourself anything more than this body, because it's really all you have. It's the source of pleasure. It's everything. It's your whole life. And when things got just so dark, I didn't even have that anymore. My body was failing me. I was ill all the time. I was sick. I just, I had gotten STDs. I wasn't taking care of these things. I was becoming mentally ill. When you don't have your body, then what do you have left? I just didn't have anything anymore. And miraculously, God just scooped me up. I really wasn't thinking about him. I wasn't thinking about going back to him. He wasn't in the equation really at all. But I learned later that he had always been with me. And he had always loved me. But I didn't love him, and I didn't know him. But when my body was failing me, and the devil knew I really had nothing else to give, because what else was there? The Lord wanted me. when not even Satan wanted me anymore. Because, you know, my usefulness was over. It was over for me. My life was ending. I ended up in a hospital, dying. Wow. And God took me back.
When you say God scooped you up, what do you mean exactly?
He just literally did. Because towards the end of my life in hustling and in prostitution, I didn't want to live anymore. I wasn't being selective about who picked me up. I didn't care. Actually, I wanted people that were really, that looked pretty dangerous to pick me up, because I didn't have the guts to end my own life. So I was hoping somebody would just kill me. And at one point, a guy did try to take my life. And I was pretty upset at the time that I lived, but I did. And I kept going in that life for a while. And then I just ended up about as ill as I could get. And I ended up in a hospital emergency room. And I didn't believe. My mother was there. She showed up to pray for me. And, you know, I cursed her at the end. And I cursed God at the end, because I didn't want anything to do with him or anything to do with Jesus Christ, with the church. I just didn't believe it. I had a lot of hate in me. Hate for everything. Hate for myself. And at one point, I knew that the gates of hell were opening for me. And I knew it, and I didn't like it. I was scared. And God gave me the choice at that last moment, and I chose him. Wow. I said, God, don't let me die this way. I don't want to die this way. And he just took me. I think there's sometimes a stereotype or misconception in people's mind about who and what type of man goes to a prostitute.
What steps did God take in your life? How did that look like?
I just called out to Jesus. I said, please save me. The reality of the life of sin that I had lived hit me, and it hadn't hit me until that moment.
Did you like the program you just watched? Help Shalom World bring more programs like this to a global audience. Your support helps us share the peace of Christ with the world. Visit shalomworld.org/donate.
What are some of the things that you saw that were so disturbing to you?
You don't see any of the dark side of prostitution in that film. You know, people getting beat up, you don't see pimps, you don't see drugs, you don't see AIDS. It was just a very sad experience, because the women inevitably would complain to you about either their husbands or boyfriends that forced them into this. I never met a female prostitute that enjoyed what she was doing. I didn't have good relationships with girls at that time, I think, because of pornography.
How did you transition from not believing in God to was that experience of seeing the gates of hell open, or how?
Yeah.
What was that?
You know, during all my life in porn and prostitution, things were actually not that bad. You know, the devil will keep you pretty comfortable, or you're not going to stay in that life. And it was a deception. Mm-hmm. I wasn't close to Christ. I didn't have the cross. I didn't carry it. I didn't know it. When that was all falling away and there was really nothing left of me, my body was gone, everything was gone. I really had nothing else to give anymore. And I had a small, I know the parable of Christ is so amazing, because I had a small mustard seed in me. Because I was raised Catholic, rather marginally Catholic. But I had a little bit. I knew him. It wasn't much. It was very, very little. I didn't know dogma. I didn't know scripture. I didn't know catechism. I didn't know the rosary. I didn't know the Hail Mary. Wow. I didn't know, and I knew very little. But I had a little bit, a little tiny bit, and it was enough. It was enough because I remembered him. I remembered him. And I hadn't thought about Jesus in probably 15 years.
Wow.
But I remembered him. It was enough.
What you mentioned at the end of your mom's prayer that you sort of cursed her, you cursed God. That's very scriptural. Job is told by his friends, curse God and die. And you sound like you got to the end of Job's rope as well.
It's scary when I think about what I did because, my prayer is for everyone, in a sinful life that they be given that last chance that I did have. But at first I didn't take it. I was just so hateful. But when the reality of the life of sin that I had lived hit me, and it hadn't hit me until that moment when it was cold and it was dark and death was scary. It was frightening. And I just thought death shouldn't be this way. Mm-hmm. And it was horrifying. And I just called out to Jesus. I said, please save me. Mm-hmm. And he did.
What steps did God take in your life? How did that look like?
Well, it hasn't been easy. And I because I came from such a very fundamental place, it was all very new to me when I came back into Catholicism. I didn't know much, but I did know I had to go to confession. And I did. I had known a priest before I got into the bad life that I got into. And I went back and I tracked him down and I went back to him because he was a very loving priest, mm-hmm. but he was also very solid. And I felt like he would be good for me mm-hmm. to go back to. And I did. And, it's difficult because I imagined it being very easy at that point, being back with Jesus, that he was just going to take care of me. And, everything was just going to be very simple and there would be no suffering and life would just be very rosy. And it wasn't that. And it took a long time to figure that out. And I fought against it. Mm-hmm. And because I didn't understand the cross. I didn't get it. Mm-hmm. I didn't want the cross because I felt like I'd suffered enough. Mm-hmm. I was like, Jesus, I've seen the dark side and I've lived I don't want to suffer anymore. Mm-hmm. But I didn't understand suffering and I didn't understand how the Lord was using that in me. But now I love the cross. I embrace the cross. A lot of people don't get that, especially my Protestant brothers don't get that. But the cross has been my salvation and it's my treasure.
What kind of sufferings are you enduring? What are you talking about now?
Well, when I was in that life, I believe that Satan kept me going as long as he could. He had blinders in front of me. So diseases that I had, STDs, everything just kind of got shoved over because, you're living such a hard life and you're just pushing your body constantly. You're not sleeping, you're taking drugs and, you're having sex all the time. And it's very, very tiring on the body. Mm-hmm. So when I left that life, I really crashed hard. And I had to have surgery. I started having all these health problems. And I was just like, oh, Lord, why I did what you wanted. I left that life. And now, everything is happening to me. And I didn't understand that. But, later I knew that the Lord was bringing him to me because I was in such pain and I was so lonely because all those friends and everybody that was in that life disappeared after that. And God was bringing me very close to him because when you're suffering like that, especially physically and mentally, you really turn to him. And I did. He was just purifying me. And I look back at that time now and I think it was a special time for me. It's strange when you think about that because it was very gruesome and tough. Yeah. That time of great physical pain. But it was really when God was just stripped me, and really took me to himself and embraced me. I've never been so intimate with him at those times when I was so sick.
Wow.
And trying so hard to just get myself cleaned up. Because after all those years, there was a lot of work to be done, just physically.
I'm going to ask you a hard question then. What about if someone could say to you, hey, could you, if you could live that over again without that suffering, would you take them up on that offer?
No. It was just, you know, it was deceiving because it was, at times you feel like you're happy in that life. You know, even trolling around in a dark park in San Francisco waiting for somebody to pick you up, you almost feel like there's happiness at those times, but it's deceptive because you're so sick. By the time you get to that point, you don't know what's good, you don't know what's bad, you don't know anything, you don't know light, you don't know dark.
Wow.
You almost literally live like a vampire because you're up at night all the time, you know, sleeping during the day. And it's a world turned upside down, literally. And it's not a place that I would ever want to go back to.
No. How do we get to a place where we confront these with society? There are some countries now where prostitution is legal, and as you said earlier, that hasn't helped at all to clean up the bad side. As you said, Nevada, where it's legal and regulated or whatever, it doesn't really do much for the people that are into the scene and hurting because of it. But how do we confront this as a society? If we look at this and recognize it for the damage that it actually causes people, have you thought about any ways that society can address the problem of prostitution?
Well, you know, it's primarily a male problem. I mean, there are male prostitutes, but which I was, but our clients are predominantly men, other men. Women that seek out male prostitutes is fairly rare. A lot of times they seek out an escort. So it's a male problem. So we have to look at boys and how boys perceive women, because if boys are raised looking at pornography or listening to these types of songs that they play or the TV shows, and they look at women as sex objects, then they are going to seek out women that are prostitutes and sell sex as a commodity when they get older, because that's the way they'll look at it. They're not going to look at this person as a human being, or somebody that they grew up with, or somebody that could be somebody's sister or somebody's mother. I mean, I knew prostitutes that had children. And they're abusing these people. So we have to start with boys and the way that they perceive women and sex.
Absolutely. I know in speaking to youth, one of the lines, as it were, that I will often use is exactly that. Imagine if that was your sister.
Exactly.
I think that really changes the perception. Very often, I remember I was an extra actor in movies when I was young, and one of the roles I had was I was supposed to gawk at a girl going down a hallway. That experience is so typical that, you know, the typical construction work or whatever you want to call it, that, wow, look at her and whatever else.
I know.
That attitude is so common, yet when you phrase it in terms of, hey, what if that was your mother or your sister? All the guys have the same reaction. Boy, I get it. and yet they're doing the same things. So that understanding is key that you pointed out, of changing the perceptions of the youth to look at women as they really are. They're sisters in the Lord. We are all the children of God. So to have that new vision of love, where we see in each other the truth that we are, in fact, all brothers and sisters, is really key.
And I don't want to lay all the blame on men and boys, because women have been deceived as well in this culture, because they view themselves as a sexual commodity. If you see women like Kim Kardashian or Miley Cyrus or Britney Spears, I mean, these are people that rose to fame and fortune because of their sexuality. and the way they exploit it. So girls will dress seductively, act seductively, and this, of course, gets young boys' attention. And it's warping their view of women. So it's a very sick relationship between everybody. Everybody is misconceived and deceived about what sex is, what the body is, what male and female is. And it needs to start with the children. It really does. Now, there's healing that's possible because I was deeply involved with this and I was healed. But when you're older, it's much more difficult. I mean, it was a difficult road for me to take. It was worth it. But I would recommend that people not take that road in the first place. Yeah. You know, raise children with healthy ideas and healthy beliefs about men, women, and sexuality. And then they won't be deceived by all this. Absolutely. This nonsense and this evil that's invaded everything. You need a lot of armor to go out there as a kid. My heart goes out to the young people today because just what I had in the 70s and 80s, they have 10 times, 20 times, 100 times worse now.
According to National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, prostitution creates a setting whereby crimes against men, women, and children become a commercial enterprise. It is an assault when he or she forces a prostitute to engage in sadomasochistic sex scenes. When a pimp compels a prostitute to submit to sexual demands as condition for employment, it is exploitation, sexual harassment, or rape. Acts that are based on the prostitute's compliance rather than her consent. The fact that a pimp or customer gives money to a prostitute for submitting to these acts does not alter the fact that child sexual abuse, rape, and/or battery occurs. It merely redefines these crimes as prostitution. In 9 countries, it was found that 68% of women, men, and transgendered people in prostitution had post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, a prevalence that is comparable to that of battered or raped women seeking help and survivors of state-sponsored torture. Across widely varying cultures on 5 continents, the traumatic consequences of prostitution were similar whether prostitution was legal, tolerated, or illegal. Individuals who may not be familiar with the sex industry believe that legalization will decrease the harm of prostitution. Legal brothels in Amsterdam, Netherlands have up to 3 panic buttons in every room because of the prevalence of attempted rapes and strangulations of the prostitutes. As Amsterdam began shutting down its legal brothels a few years ago, Mayor Job Cohen acknowledged that the Dutch had been wrong about legal prostitution. It did not make prostitution safer. Instead, he said legal prostitution increased organized crime. It functioned like a magnet for pimps. Trafficking increased after legal prostitution. 80% of women in Dutch prostitution had been trafficked. Trafficking is most prevalent wherever prostitution is legal or decriminalized. When prostitution is legal, pimps operate with impunity and great ease. The trafficking of children has increased in New Zealand since decriminalization, especially the trafficking of ethnic Maori children. Since decriminalization, street prostitution has spiraled out of control, especially in New Zealand's largest city, Auckland. A 200 to 400% increase in street prostitution has been reported, and because of the increased organized crime since decriminalization, Auckland gangs have waged turf wars over the control of prostitution. A decade ago, Sweden named prostitution as a form of violence against women that fosters inequality. As a result, Sweden criminalized buyers and decriminalized the person who is a prostitute. Iceland, Norway, and South Korea have now passed similar laws, with the United Kingdom passing legislation that moves in a similar direction. The intimate relationship between prostitution and trafficking is highlighted when buyers are criminalized. Sweden now has the fewest trafficked women in the European Union. The law interferes with the international business of pimping and the practice of buying sex. According to Melissa Farley, founder of Prostitution Research and Education, more than 90% of individuals in the prostitution industry want to escape from prostitution. In order to escape, they need housing, education, jobs that provide a sustainable income, healthcare, and emotional support. We should all be working on providing women with alternatives to prostitution.
One of the ways in which the sort of authorities that are still sane, if you will, on the issue look at confronting this. I was just in Ireland with Jim Wells, a politician in Northern Ireland, who described the new program they have for confronting human trafficking. He described some of the most unbelievable practices where pimps take young girls in buses even and bring them to big events like the Super Bowl. They rent out almost whole hotels where they put one woman in each room type of thing and just have men come in once every 25 minutes or so. It's an insane practice. And these girls are abused, scared, and sometimes even kidnapped. And Jim Wells was telling me that they were going to confront it in Northern Ireland, and they were going to make it a place where it's very hard to conduct that business. Their method or their way forward was to make it criminal for the men who go to purchase prostitution and also publish their names in the local newspapers, noting that they had been arrested, caught in prostitution. And he said on the stats that they did, that this, from the men that they spoke to off the record and without identifying who they were, this would really put a stop to it. Because that public shame would make for some real deterrence. So there are methods for society to confront this with the law, as it should, because this is such not only a demeaning, it's a dangerous practice which harms so many women and men. And really, from a spiritual perspective, the true perspective, it also damages maybe even eternally these folks. Not only those who are employed in prostitution, but also those who use prostitution very much so.
And these men that are Johns, they're not a stereotypical man that you would say, like a sleazeball or something. The majority of my clients were heterosexual, married, rather well-to-do men. That asked for my services and other people. I think there's sometimes a stereotype or conception in people's mind about who and what type of man goes to a prostitute. Like there's some sort of outsider. It's not. That's what's so scary about it. These are middle-class men with families and with children a lot of times. I had men that came to me and would talk to me about their children. I had a high school principal that came to me and talked about the boys at school. It was scary.
Wow.
Yeah, they came from all walks of life. You name it, I saw them. High-tech guys, single guys, married, children, everything. It's an addiction. It's a very serious sickness.
I think from one, praise God that there is still healing and resurrection. We have seen in your testimony, Joseph, and in those that we received from the experts, that this career choice, as it's called, is no career choice at all.
No.
There's little choice. There is definitely no salvation. No. And it seems like a living hell.
It's an act of desperation on the part of these people,
Joseph, thank you so much for sharing your testimony with us.
Thank you for your bravery. Thank you.
It was awesome. I think that you've really smashed through a bunch of these misconceptions that people have.
Thank you.
Having lived on the other side, you give testimony from there, able on both ends of this question to answer the questions, show the truth for what it really is. I want to encourage you that there are resources out there to assist you to come to truth on these matters and to get help. especially in the getting help area. CatholicTherapists.com have excellent Catholic therapists who are able to help you in confusion with sexuality, in dealing with addictions, prostitution, pornography, the whole gamut of things. There is also resources on lifesitenews.com to keep up with what's happening in reality in terms of prostitution all around the world. And Joseph Sciambra has written a book about his experiences called Swallowed by Satan. It is a book that is for mature audiences only because it describes vividly his experiences and has some information. It is especially useful for those who are incredulous, who don't believe what happens on the other side. This will really tell you what does. We have been again given a wealth of information, facts that back up the truth that comes from God and is taught by His church. This information has shown us, these facts, these lived experiences have shown us that the truth of human sexuality is actually beautiful. God has given us this gift to point us to the reality of heaven, to His own Trinitarian relationship within the family stamped throughout mankind for all time. We are told in Corinthians to remember that our bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit, and that is the truth. We are not our own. We are been bought with a high price. So we are to give glory in our bodies to God. With that in mind, let us close for this week and remember to speak the truth with love. God bless you.